Welcome to UBIRCH Talk. This is the expert talk on sustainability topics from UBIRCH, the provider of the ESG Data Exchange Network. Our topic today is competitive advantage sustainability and how ARMA Freight is redefining transparency in logistics. And we are pleased that so many of you have tuned in and are here with us today. My name is Matthias Schindel. I'm the moderator today, and I would like to first welcome my guests. First, we have Lars-Kristian Strade, who is a project manager at ARMA Freight. Hello, Alaska.
Good morning. Hello.
And then we have Karim Attia, CEO of UBIRCH, and also a key project partner between YouTube and ARMA Freight, which we would like to discuss, in particular today. Hello, Kai.
Hello.
Yes, it's great that both of you are here. Before we dive into the topic, I will briefly cover the organizational details for everyone who might be listening for the first time today. We will be talking for about 3/4 of an hour, maybe a little longer, and then at the end there will be a Q&A. This means that if you have any questions for us, or if you would like to let us know something, please use the comment function. You can find that on the right-hand side where you can write a question at any time. We will keep an eye on it and definitely address any questions that arise at the end. Well, clicked. Amen. Let's take a look at today's topic. Our topic today is about sustainability in logistics, specifically sustainability as a competitive advantage. After all, 5.5% of all CO2 emissions worldwide are caused by logistics and transport, and the trend is rather increasing. That should actually be reason enough for a strong interest in the topic of sustainability among all those involved. In fact, until recently, this was not really a major issue on the customer side. It was primarily about time and money in logistics. Apparently, it actually took the impetus from the EU CSRD directive for emissions to suddenly become a topic of inquiry. It is quite obvious that many clients will need to measure and report the emissions of their transports in the future, and eventually they will also have to reduce them. It's never easy when a provider is only prompted by customers to address a topic. It is certainly better when one has already been engaged with it for a long time. And so it is with our conversation partner today, the logistics broker from Hamburg, ARMA Freight, where they started addressing this topic early on. And so, in a way, he has also set himself the goal of getting ahead of the wave, as Lars-Kristian revealed to us in the preliminary discussion. Before we discuss how you approach this and what your experiences have been so far, we would like to get to know you a little personally first. Christian, from what I know about you, here's a brief summary. You are 37 years old. You live in Norderstedt near Hamburg. You started your career in logistics after completing a commercial training program, and you have also added a bachelor's degree in business administration and economic psychology. Respect to you, 2001. That was about 10 years ago. And since then, you have essentially built your career at ARMA Freight. You were there in sales, in business development, you were deputy head of export, and now you are a project manager. So, can we say that you are a true logistics professional, or is that more or less accurate? What continues to fascinate you about this industry?
That's actually pretty much correct. I have indeed been with the training company ARMA Freight. That is practically my first employer, and I stayed there and learned. I then worked for a few years at a subsidiary of ARMA Freight, returned to ARMA Freight, initially in operations, then in sales, in business development, and afterwards again as deputy department head in export. I have now been responsible for digitalization and sustainability topics with us for almost a year, so that is quite accurate.
Okay, thank you very much. If we get to know you a little better, my second conversation partner today is Karim Attia, one of the two CEOs of UBIRCH GmbH. Karim, you are also a Hamburger, and as I know, you studied computer science there, or as it's called today, computer science. After that, there are startups in the media and IT sectors, I think. Otherwise, the H is around. Have you ever dealt with logistics in your career?
I must confess, I didn't really grow up as a small fry in my career. because my father was a shipbuilding engineer and he built ships that were sailing in the Mediterranean. And during the summer holidays, we always traveled on break bulk carriers between Greece and Egypt, sort of like being on the Cap San Diego, among the crew quarters. It was truly an experience. And we then passed through small details like the Piraeus Canal, where you felt like you had an M on the canal walls, on both the left and right. But that was basically the kickoff for my passion for the sea, ports, and ships. In this respect, I am very glad that I am now also dealing with it professionally, and I am very much looking forward to what we have planned.
Okay, great. So logistics is somehow already ingrained in you due to family influence. The year 2001 makes perfect sense. We'll tell a little more, and then we'll dive into the topic a bit about your company, Christian Arma Freight, and what can be discovered, founded 30 years ago in Hamburg. You organize, arrange, and sell international transport. I have read that. There are global offices with 250 employees and agents in many countries in 2021, and you refer to yourselves, which I found interesting, as a flexible logistics boutique. I found that interesting. Lars-Kristian, what do you mean by that? Because with transports, you are certainly not a small player, or is it to be understood that way? So,
sizes are relatively speaking. Of course, there are the very large players in the market that are significantly bigger, thinking in millions. We are exactly that. We are a medium-sized company, owner-managed, and we have been in the market for 30 years now. And yes, exactly, we are actually something like a boutique. We are very individually positioned. We pay close attention to the requirements and wishes of our customers. We do not want to offer off-the-shelf standards in that sense, but always look at what the customer desires, what could be the best solution for them, and how the best solution can specifically look for their concrete problem. This is what our approach is and what has hopefully defined us and set us apart from the competition and the market over the last 30 years, and it has been relatively successful.
Okay, so customer specific, that's basically what makes the boutique stand out, and not standard goods. How can one imagine this? The customer inquires with Yusan, saying, I have something to transport from here to there. What options are there? And then you make suggestions. Basically, you select the optimal items from the offering according to the wishes of the customer.
Exactly. The market is, I would say, very broadly structured overall. It is rare for a customer to have no idea at all about how they want to move their goods. That is not the case. Rather, they usually come with a relatively clear idea. What can be done is, of course, some route optimization, looking at which providers are available in the market, whether we are talking about road transport or in the pre- and post-hauls in sea freight or air freight, and what options are available there. And of course, emissions play a role now, but naturally, so do price and speed, among other topics. And we always try to find the best solution for the customer, so that, as I just mentioned, they receive the best solution for their individual case.
That means you obviously have an enormous overview in this way, because you always have to optimize for the customers. So, you know the spectrum as well as the back of your hand, what offers are available, what they entail, their pros and cons, and can then draw from your experience to say what the best alternative is for 2021. Can we think of it that way?
Yes. Market penetration is relatively important, meaning that one needs to see what is happening in the individual markets globally. We represent this, of course, with our own offices, for example, in China and Southeast Asia, but here in Europe, we do so with our head office, or alternatively with agents that we have in our network, with whom we have been working for decades in some cases. These are established structures that we have in place, and these are professionals who bring expertise and help us find the right solutions.
Okay, great. So I understand that this is a unique selling proposition for you, that you know what the market offers in terms of transport options, and that you are likely able to find the best option for your customer who has specific considerations and goals in mind. Let me guess, you've hinted at it already. It's not just about time and money, but recently there's probably also been a shift towards asking about emissions, or how we can transport the emissions data. Is that also the reason why you are now dealing with this topic? and have undertaken this project, or how did it come about?
The project did not necessarily originate solely from the customer side. It was also an intrinsic motivation of the company. Being aware of its relevance and the importance of the topic itself. But as you just hinted, it is indeed the case that there has been an increased demand noticed in all markets in recent years. This began primarily in Europe and the USA and is now also continuing in Asia as the demand for more sustainable solutions, to put it relatively clearly, is becoming increasingly stronger. So it's not that price no longer plays a role. That is still the case, but the issue of emissions and sustainability is becoming increasingly relevant. And as mentioned in the introduction, the CSRD here in Europe contributes a bit to this. We can also see that. So we feel that the CSRD provides a certain impetus, making companies more aware of it, and also acting as a trigger for even more activity to emerge. And our aim is, of course, to get ahead of the wave, so to speak, and to meet these requirements before they come crashing down on everyone. This is somewhat the motivation behind why we started this project together.
Yes, I understand. What interests me now is that you say the demand is coming and developing. You were already on the way with the topic, fortunately. Now, do customers actually want to optimize based on emissions, or do they just want to know and need the emissions data for my transport?
It's mutual. Of course, the demand arises for reporting reasons so that as a customer, you receive your incurred emissions, which is quite clear. This currently mainly concerns the larger customers we have. This is, of course, a natural consequence. What we expect now is simply that this new directive will cascade into the market and that this demand will continue to push into the market, and that more and more customers will naturally want to receive this data in a clean manner. On the other hand, there is, of course, the motivation to derive avoidance, as companies also have their own goals. Well, our customers certainly have goals for emission reduction and promoting sustainability. And in this context, it is practically manifold. One can have both approaches or multiple approaches. On one hand, there is data delivery, but there is also avoidance, which means good optimization, alternative fuels, and compensation options. This is relatively diverse.
I understand. So in the preliminary conversation, you told me that you had started, so to speak, out of a drive to engage with the topic of sustainability as a company. And then, parallel to that, the demand from the market also emerged and intensified. And then there was your decision. I found the expression so beautiful. But probably if you come from the coast, it's clear we want to get ahead of the wave. Now, what do you mean by that? I can picture it. It's like you don't want to have to paddle behind, but rather surf on the wave. I understand. But what exactly have you set out for yourselves?
So, on one hand, it is the case that this coming wave particularly means that we think or suspect, this is of course just an assumption, that with the CSRD, practically everyone in the market will have to rush to provide data in some way. And this data, of course, needs to improve. And then we naturally thought about how we can implement this as quickly as possible in our context, and how we can also position ourselves in such a way that there is a sustainable solution that helps us to obtain this data directly from those who generate it. That is precisely the approach being pursued, because the deeper each individual participant understands what they are actually imitating, the better they can act accordingly. And if everyone only works with, let's say, nutritional values, then that won't lead anywhere. That's why our approach is to continue and make the data as accurate as possible.
So optimal transparency, one could say, in your offerings, 2001.
Correct. So, of course, it's about improving data quality internally, but then providing the customer with exactly this data so that they can derive value from it, as they naturally need this data for themselves. What I just said is that the cascading will take place from the large back rows, so to speak, in the supply chain to the smallest possible participants. And how long this journey is, no one can estimate yet, but I think it will be a challenge for some. And of course, we wanted to be well prepared for that.
So it sounds great and logical, but it probably wasn't that simple after all. What are the biggest challenges that you initially saw?
One can say this relatively clearly. Of course, data availability is the first approach. Making data available and enabling calculations is the first point. And in 21, one had to take certain internal steps to make things visible at all. One must be clear about the exact processes of their transports. One must then monitor this data accordingly. And it must be calculated. And then we are still a long way from receiving the data directly from those who work for us in the supply chain. So we are essentially a broker and not operating in self-entry usant, and we have to rely on what our partners provide us. And we are not there yet. We are still in the calculation phase. The next step, after these data have improved, is to reach a point where we receive data directly from our suppliers, our partners. And as a result, we hope for an improvement in data quality in the long term, or ideally in the short term, for the year 2001.
Okay, so it's really about the data that you need to collect. It sounds like a lot of work, and somewhere along the way, you clearly decided that you can't do it alone. You want to seek support for this. We also want to collaborate with a partner on this task, right?
Correct. That is exactly the solution. At the end of the day, that we see, so to speak, that our capacities are limited in that sense. Of course, there are experts in the market for this, and we have looked around and found the content here. Otherwise, we wouldn't have come across you at UBIRCH.
Okay. Did you have any criteria that were important to you in the search for partners after almost everyone in the previous one?
Yes, of course. So there should fundamentally be a very clear understanding of the topic. That is the most important thing. So the sustainability issue must, of course, be a priority for our partner and also be at the core of the business model. That's quite clear. On the other hand, it's about how to handle data, which is the approach to create added value, because there are relatively, let's say, many providers in the market that derive a calculation, but how one might also take the next step that we just mentioned. That was the approach where we said that 2021 was important to us. Exactly.
Okay, good. You've already revealed that it's not a secret, which is why we're talking today about your choice of UBIRCH as a partner, essentially as a companion on this mission. This brings me to Karim. Kai, could you just tell us, so to speak, you have brought this project to life and are leading it. What were the tasks that Arma Freight set for UBIRCH?
Yes, as Lars mentioned at the beginning, the goal is to create as much transparency as possible within the supply chain regarding emissions. So the expertise of Arma Freight regarding efficiency in terms of price and speed, etc., was indeed present. The topic of emissions needed to be supplemented, and we actually had the case where it was necessary to provide corresponding information for an entire year retroactively and relatively quickly because the client needed it for their own reporting. And that was basically the introduction to the whole thing. We naturally use this to determine what information is available, which information we can use for the assessment of the transaction. And the more detailed and better it is, the more accurate one becomes. It must also be clearly stated, and Lars has already mentioned this, that everything is initially based on the so-called concept of secondary data, 2001 averages, according to which evaluations are made, which in the best case, and we actually have an ISO standard available in this industry. So it's not just something that someone made up and used casually, but rather the industry has come to an agreement on how certain transports should be evaluated. What have we done for 2023? Building on that, we will now move into the refinement. As Lars mentioned in the context of the CSRD, it is not just about working with industry standard values, but rather about obtaining more accurate values from the value chain, because the goal is to improve, and this is referred to as primary data, meaning data provided by suppliers for the services that have been utilized, which is based on more accurate information than what is typically available in industry standards.
Sorry, I think this is an important point that we should briefly explain for the listeners. Primary data, secondary data. Perhaps you could explain again what the differences are in a clear way. I believe this is a crucial topic.
We have a small chart for that. It would be the one with number 7. If you could show that briefly. We don't want to go into detail on that now. It is meant to show that the terms primary data and secondary data are not something we invented, but are part of a standard that is used worldwide to determine and report greenhouse gas emissions. This is the so-called Greenhouse Gas Protocol. They defined this distinction between the two data types years ago. Primary data is data that is reported directly to me by members of my value chain. Secondary data refers to data that comes from another source, not directly from my value chain, to clarify this broad distinction. And if you were to briefly move on to the next chart, the following happens. There are actually 5 types of data. If you could go to page 8 for a moment, please. Matthias. Yes, exactly. Here we are. Perfect. At its core, there are 5 types of information that can be used to calculate greenhouse gas emissions. The best part, also presented in a nice green, is when you receive data from your suppliers that tells you how much greenhouse gas is generated for the type of service you have utilized. This is the ultimate challenge and also the long-term goal, as these are the most accurate data one can obtain. The next level of quality is the so-called secondary data points. These are data that are based on an industry standard. They, but are generally currently not even supplier specific, meaning they are not related to a particular supplier, but are used in a more general sense. That's also why there is the small circle down there. This is what most people are working with nowadays. However, it has the significant disadvantage that one cannot easily distinguish which supplier or which member of my value chain contributes more or less, and that, as has been mentioned several times, these are industry standard values and not specific values of the actual performance that has been utilized. When one goes a little further, they often use these industry standard values to evaluate individual suppliers and members of the value chain. And then there is a third area, the proprietary data. This is what is nicely referred to in Germany as Eigenbeleg. You know it from accounting. I just enter what I roughly know. This is basically the worst option, but all of these are used in the market. The main focus is actually to use industry standard values in a general way, rather than being specific to any supplier in order to calculate something.
So, when I interrupt you, I'm trying to clarify. So you say that secondary data is basically the standard today. Everyone is doing that, right? First of all, and this is basically like an emissions factor, right? So I know that when I transport something, there is a certain emission expected per ton and kilometer of distance, or I don't know if nautical miles are used, 2001. And that is the average value, and it is then used, correct?
Exactly. However, I need to correct one thing briefly. It's not the case that everyone does this. This is what would theoretically be available to most. However, it's hardly used by anyone, to be clear. This ISO standard is brand new. It was released at the end of last year, and it precisely defines the metric you described. There is the term ton-kilometer, which refers to how much freight in tons was moved over how many kilometers, depending on which media and steps are involved. There are different emission factors that indicate how much CO2 is produced for this type of transport over this distance. These industrial values have been around since last year, but they are far from being used as a standard. This is something that is just beginning to develop. And although it does not yet have the quality that is actually required by the regulation, which clearly states that you must improve year by year, not only in your total emissions output that you attribute to yourself, but also in the way you obtain the information. So the share of primary data in the assessment of what you do must improve year by year. Is there a clear roadmap that we all need to follow? But most are still doing nothing. Those who are starting are working in the inflated bars, but the goal is clearly the green bar.
So now I understand. So secondary data refers to industry data, which not everyone is using yet, but would likely be available from standards and databases. And it sounds to me like this when I compare it with primary data, meaning data that I really have. Imagine it like this. So primary data means I want to know from this shipping company how many emissions this ship actually produced on this journey. And then I divide that by the number of containers that were on board, and then I have clean primary data. But that sounds like a lot more effort. But why not stick with secondary data? Isn't that enough?
That's the cascade that Lars has already talked about. So the reader knows this quite well. But the customer who uses 10 wheels does not. This means that if suppliers can report what they are directly responsible for under their own control, then it can be aggregated at a higher level. And that is also the core idea of our ESG data exchange network. Now, I might be able to share a bit more about that later. It is sufficient for everyone to have knowledge of what they can control and where they can measure very precisely, and to know exactly what happens when they provide this knowledge so that it can then be cleanly aggregated upwards. If that is not available, one has to work with generalized, very broad industry averages.
Yes, and what are the disadvantages of the mean?
He is basically hitting the whole sheet. It must be said very clearly. You can no longer distinguish whether it was a highly efficient vehicle powered by fuel cells, for example, or an electric vehicle, or whether it is one that operates on heavy fuel oil, to illustrate the point clearly. Only the route from there to there is covered by a ship, and a very broad, all-encompassing standard value is used. The accuracy increases the more detailed one knows what type of vehicle it is, and with which operating resources and fuels it has been operated. These are the exciting pieces of information that are not available in a highly aggregated form. You can only obtain them accurately if you are the operator of the corresponding vehicle. And then the idea comes that he can naturally provide the primary data, allowing users of his service to receive much more accurate information, and of course a lot more variance in comparison to a flat industrial average.
I think I understand that. So that means if I actually want to improve and say, I will choose this supplier or this, let's say, this freight company instead of another freight company because it has lower emissions for the same route. I wouldn't even know that.
If this information is provided by the supplier, I can figure it out. Otherwise, I would have to take an industry standard value that treats both equally, and then there would be no difference, and I wouldn't gain anything by switching suppliers.
So, primary data. Got it. Lars-Kristian, how are you going to obtain the primary data? How do you plan to find it?
Of course, this is a very simple matter because everyone is immediately happy and can send everything right away with the first call, right? That is exactly the big challenge, of course. So, all of this data falls under our scope 3. The other scope 1 and 2 data are, of course, a bit easier for us to generate. However, everything that falls under scope 3 in the transport services we provide, which is essential for our overall service as a company, presents us with what I would call an endless list of potential service providers that we would need to connect with and query, and they would also need to provide this data individually. And that is, of course, an incredibly large challenge in the sense that if we really want the primary data, which we do, because exactly what Karim just said is the approach that will ultimately lead to improvement. And there we have, of course, found a solution with UBIRCH, who, as Ibrahim just hinted, creates opportunities through a network solution to derive automation so that we can receive the data somewhat automatically by connecting the suppliers.
Okay, I think this is the moment, Karim, where you should tell us a bit about the UBIRCH product, about the ESG data exchange network. Shall we take a look at it?
Sure, exactly. Do we also have a small overview chart that outlines it a bit? We see ourselves as a platform for sustainable value chains, and this platform actually has 2 areas. Something like a yellow pages for sustainable service providers, and a management infrastructure to manage and analyze these service providers. And it is based on 3 core concepts. One of them is, as Lars already mentioned, the main problem nowadays is actually obtaining data. So how can we support this? What we do is make it as easy as possible to provide data, to gather it, and to make it available. Partly with the help of AI support, which everyone is doing a bit these days. But here it is particularly important because a lot is currently in flux, and our assistant has a vast knowledge of the standards, the ISO norms, and the regulations, so you can quickly get an answer if you are not exactly sure what to enter where. The other thing, and this is the most important, is a concept that we might explain briefly in detail later, which we call sharing is caring. The point is that once data is provided, it serves not only the person who requested it, but also anyone else who uses that particular vehicle. If I have defined and made available the emission efficiency of a specific vehicle, it benefits everyone else who uses that vehicle as well. So far, most solutions have resulted in this information being lost. These are silos. We have something that we explicitly call an exchange platform, an exchange system where this data is provided once and then made available to the community. And last but not least, it is also important within the framework of regulation, especially for reporting companies, that the regulation states it must be machine readable and audit proof. This means that the information exchanged here must be verifiable by a potential auditor, by an accountant, and we do this by digitally signing everything that is sent back and forth, everything that is defined, so that it is verifiable and secure against revisions. And to touch again on the sharing is caring aspect, it has indeed always been the case that a supplier was asked by their customer, which we can wonderfully see in this picture, and then provided the information to their customer. And the next customer asked again, and it was delivered once more. And in case of doubt, in various formats, in various ways. And above all, always the same, always new. This is in the complexity that Lars has already mentioned, where it is no longer about exchanging information between 2 or 3 people, but rather having to deliver to hundreds, sometimes thousands of suppliers and thousands of customers, which is no longer feasible. And that's why we introduced this principle of sharing is caring. And okay, once you've done the work of gathering information and providing it to someone, why not make it available to everyone? They are generally available to everyone as a benefit within their sustainability measures, and they do not need to make any additional effort to obtain them. This helps both sides. It assists those who provide the data, but also those who need the data, as they do not have to onboard someone new repeatedly and explain again why the information is important. It is simply available, and with that, one can significantly increase the speed of improving their footprint, because the data is already there in case of doubt.
Okay, I believe it has come out well that acting as an intermediary is extremely helpful when the data is available at a central location and everyone essentially has only one partner with whom they need to exchange data or from whom they receive data. This also helps us with the standardization in regulation.
So, the data that needs to be provided and in what format is defined, we have simply implemented this in technology so that one does not have to constantly get used to new formats and such. There is a standardized format, an exchange format that can be used by any system.
That's what you said. If we return to the project, the first task was actually to evaluate historical data. So I think those were the data from the previous year. The past transports should be evaluated. What have you done about that?
We have indeed linked our systems and obtained the transport data with their individual transport routes across various modes, as they were all multimodal transports, and then evaluated them with the best knowledge and conscience based on the information we received. This means that we knew from where to where, pre, main, and post, and which transport vehicles were used there. We knew what type of freight was used, and then evaluated it according to the ISO standard and fed that back into the system. And I would say we learned a lot in the process.
Can you also provide examples of experiences?
Yes, I don't know. Do you want to talk about it, Lars? Should I?
Well, I already hinted at this earlier. The big challenge is particularly the data source at the end of the day, which is used for the calculations. In 2001, I would say that if one has not gained any experience in this area beforehand, then the data sources are certainly not as developed as one would like them to be in order to derive a really good calculation. Of course, we immediately recognized things that we had to implement very quickly in order to derive an improvement. We have done this so that we will have significantly better data for this year, at least when it comes to the 2001 calculations, which are secondary data. So that's the first point. And of course, it will also serve as an ongoing example.
Data quality, data was not as expected. What does that mean?
Well, I would say that in the configuration of orders, it hasn't always been the case that all the data needed to cover an entire supply chain was systematically available in that form, because it simply wasn't designed that way for the calculations we required. This means that there were gaps. We had to close these gaps at short notice, meaning that the mode of transport was not consistently maintained everywhere. This is one example. In the preliminary stage, one can, of course, use the truck, but one can also utilize inland shipping or the train. So, to put it simply, if one does not specify within their systems, then they have to rework this data, because otherwise they only have data from A to B and from B to C. And over time, the granularity would indeed improve. So what we want to do now is, of course, to dive deeper into the data that we want to examine more closely, for example, by looking specifically at the ships. Which ship are we actually using on a particular journey? Exactly. That can be said quite accurately. And corresponding. Identifiers or parameters can be transmitted that make the calculation much more precise than if one simply states that it was a sea vessel. Then one specifies exactly which ship it was and more precise. Values are provided, thus getting significantly closer to the goal of improving data quality.
Okay, understood. So one could say that for you as a logistics provider, the priority used to be that the goods had to arrive on time and the costs had to be right. Now, there is a new requirement that you also need a clean protocol. How was it actually moved and with which ship was it moved? Not just whether it was a ship, but which ship and so on.
Yes, the data was somehow always there, but it wasn't maintained in the way that would be needed for the calculations. And that is currently changing. Of course, one must also see that one becomes more efficient in 2021, deriving automation from it. This is all part of what I would call the learning that follows, and that leads to subsequent projects that result in a significant overall improvement. That's one aspect. So by taking action here, it can be said, especially for potential listeners, that this is a means to improve overall. 2001, and we are currently realizing this. So this is a point that is quite significant when you create a much greater depth and quality in the sum of your data, not just the emissions-related ones.
Okay, so that means engaging with the sustainability topic helps you by providing better data, which can trigger entirely different effects. Yes, definitely. Interesting aspect. So there's actually a double benefit in this story. Karim, I believe you wanted to comment on something.
You mentioned that one example of the ship traveling from Hamburg to Hong Kong, which originally went through the Suez Canal and then couldn't for a while, is still problematic. But yes, that means that the routes were price relevant, but they are also massively relevant for example, the emissions that arise from them. And these details, for example, about the type of ship, even down to the individual ship, are things that you didn't necessarily need for billing, but are now very relevant for optimizing emissions, because we can track the exact routes via AIS and then know exactly how many kilometers were in the ton kilometer. Context, just like with airplanes, etc.
When you consider a ship's journey and, as you just mentioned, the Suez Canal, if the route becomes longer without us being able to influence it, then it naturally becomes a significantly larger lever if the ship operates and works more efficiently, because then the distance is longer. Then the factor that generates savings, there is of course the efficiency of the ship, which is quite different, even if the total emissions increase. That is of course significantly smaller due to the distances, exactly, but that does make a difference.
What comes to my mind regarding this story is that you will be asked in advance, as I understand it, optimized according to the customer's wishes based on duration, costs, and possibly in the future also emissions. This means that one essentially makes a forecast and says, for example, this will take approximately this long, or this will produce approximately this much emissions. This means that you need data beforehand to estimate that. However, when it is actually being transported, one must think of the situation with the Suez Canal. Not everything is predictable, and it could very well be that things turned out quite differently. In 2021, is there essentially a follow-up with data, such as planned data and actual data? How do you handle double-entry bookkeeping in this context? How can one imagine this?
The planning data is naturally generated in advance. So I would say during the proposal creation, in the planning, and in the consultation with the customer, which is what I explained earlier, and what is then actually the implementation. And then, of course, this example with the Suez Canal is a wonderful one. If something unforeseen happens during the journey, then you naturally have different values. That goes without saying. You just can't change them anymore, that's the point. But it's important, of course, to incorporate some predictivity into the whole topic so that we can always predict such cases for the customer as quickly as possible. And I mean, it doesn't have to be a situation where entire shipping routes are no longer passable. It could simply be a storm that leads to the likelihood that at the time of your journey, the route may take a bit longer because ships have to take detours. Especially when we look at the hurricane season in the Atlantic or the typhoon season in the Pacific. And that is, of course, a bit more forward-thinking because the depth of data and the quality of data required for this are quite different. But I think that is also part of the future because emissions will simply gain such relevance. At least that's how we see it, that the opportunity to reduce them in relation to costs will eventually become much more significant than it currently is today.
That means today it is not yet so pronounced. For now, time and money take priority over emissions. One could say that, but do you expect that this will change?
We are very sure of that.
The fact that CO is being priced will play a role in itself.
That's exactly the point. This lever will certainly make an impact. Every ton of CO2 that you can avoid in 2021 will naturally be convertible into money. And one must also see it this way. Of course, one can look for compensation options, but one should always first try to avoid emissions before offsetting them, because that is the best way to tackle the whole issue.
Absolutely. Now, the second step was to connect the suppliers directly. Keyword primary data. Where do we stand on that? How far along are we? How is it going?
Who will do that? I can start. Exactly. So the primary data is now the next step to improve data quality. And the onboarding or engagement of individual suppliers is now the next step that we have started. Exactly. We will gradually approach each of our suppliers. We will address them. We will ask them to provide this data. And of course, we will also try to onboard them into the ESG data exchange network of Hubert Schmidt, because that is exactly the added value for these suppliers of ours. They are likely to supply multiple customers just as we do. And at the same time, they also need to navigate the data from suppliers as they, like us, rely on different parties throughout the entire supply chain.
Kai, could you elaborate a bit and perhaps explain how the connection to the many suppliers will actually work technically?
Exactly. So fundamentally, it is about providing primary data, meaning the emission characteristics of the service I offer within this network. And there are different levels of granularity, which somewhat depends on how far along the supplier is in their own sustainability story. It must be said clearly. The minimum requirement would be a so-called corporate carbon footprint, which is the total emissions of my company. And the corresponding metric would be the total revenue. And then one can determine the share of total emissions from my supplier that I have contributed to through the services I have utilized. Of course, this is also highly aggregated and not entirely precise. There are various levels among them that keep improving. Ideally, it is best to have a so-called product carbon footprint for the performance, e.g., the emissions of a specific truck for a specific route. So then you need something like the load factor, and then you can directly calculate the emissions that were generated. The beauty of it is that once this information has been provided by the supplier, every one of their customers can use it directly without bothering the supplier again, as it generally applies and is not customer specific. There are people who are already very advanced in their sustainability journey, who can even provide information at the transaction level, meaning they have calculated the emissions value alongside the invoice. These are the big players. DHL is one such example, where there are interfaces that provide information at the transaction level, and we can then directly link that with the shipments that have been created by Arma Freight. We need to ensure that this segment of a delivery is carried out by a service provider capable of providing information even at the transaction level. Then we can link them together via APIs. We do the same in other industries. With E.ON, we have something that provides daily accurate energy deliveries along with energy mix and emission values. So From a very granular overall company perspective with revenue down to the transaction level, all things are possible depending on how far the respective supplier has already progressed in their journey. And of course, we support that. It is also part of the onboarding concept and the concept we have developed where we address the various categories of helping hands in the supply chain. And how far along are you? Come, we will help you if you are not quite sure about certain things or if you are just starting out in participating in this game and making the world a little better together.
So that means we have understood that primary data is not the same as primary data. When a supplier delivers something, it can range from the corporate carbon footprint, which represents the company's emissions over the entire year, to the emissions triggered by that specific transport, indicating a wide spectrum. This also means that we have primary data as information, but it is not yet clear how to calculate based on that. This means that there needs to be someone behind the scenes who organizes and structures the information so that at Arma Freight, the relevant information can always be evaluated and utilized.
Exactly, and we have implemented that in technology in accordance with the regulations, because even if there can be a wide range of primary data and its quality, the regulation requires that one does not estimate anything oneself, but rather receives it reported from their supply chain. So we can definitely ensure and also verify that this is not something that Lars entered himself, but rather that it came from his supplier XY, as it was digitally signed by this supplier. This means that the responsibility for the accuracy of the data has been delegated to the value chain. And this is a very important aspect that keeps coming up in regulation. The point is, one must provide proof, and that is why many become nervous, as Lars mentioned at the beginning. The wave will crash down on many. The information that is now being provided is equivalent to the financial report. The board and management are responsible for this with a be in jail, as the saying goes, if it is not accurate. In 2021, we ensure that the information used is compliant with regulations, and we also provide this as a benefit within the framework of the ESG Data Exchange Network. We ensure compliance regarding data provenance and the further use of data. The additional USP should not be overlooked.
Okay, that brings me to ask this yesterday. How is the project going from your perspective? What have your experiences been so far? One wonders. You always have a certain plan for a project and then reality hits. How did everything turn out? What did you have to change? How did the collaboration go?
Overall, the collaboration is working exceptionally well, one could say. Contact with Karim, as well as his team in the background, is always very cooperative and friendly, making for a truly wonderful collaboration. But we have already talked about where we learned something. There were certainly certain points where we needed to take action, and we didn't quite expect that in terms of quality beforehand. But these are things that we were all able to implement, and that is also a success experience in that sense. And yes, we are continuously improving in that regard. This is simply a result of discovering improvement potentials in completely different areas, as I mentioned earlier, and also recognizing the advantages that arise from it. I didn't expect that, for example, in this quality. However, what can be said or must be said is that if you want to give others tips in this regard, find a partner who operates at your level, who speaks the same language as you. This is very important, and we have that here. And yes, pay attention to your data quality in the background. This is a point where I say it is very important to really start now and not wait, let's say, for a year when it will be like, oh, what about the reporting obligations now? We need to deliver the annual reports for 2024. What about the emission data and the ESG data as a whole? It's a bit more than just emissions that are required by the CSRD, but start with that now and get going, because what you leave behind has to be caught up on. It was already like that in school.
Yes, that's great feedback and good tips. I believe so too. Karim, how would you summarize in just a few words what we have learned at UBIRCH, and what tips would you give?
I can really only echo the same sentiment. So this is on an equal footing. We have various types of network members from different industries, as we call them, meaning our customers. And here we had a prime example that it is not done casually just because it has to be, but that there has been a real intensive engagement with it, embedding it into the overall corporate strategy. That's why there are also positive side effects in other areas of the company. This is something I can really recommend to everyone. Do it just like Armor Freight, because it can only be managed part-time, as you have to do a little bit here and there. It's not feasible to deliver everything with the demands that come your way. And as Lars already mentioned, one should start in a timely manner because the complexity should not be underestimated. There are many aspects that drive success, including data quality, which forms the basis for calculations, relationships with suppliers, and the ability to clearly communicate to suppliers what it means for them. These are not things that happen overnight. So we have a project plan. I don't know if you want to briefly show it, where we say that we started discussing in Q, then in Q. We initiated the collaboration, first establishing the foundations regarding data quality and calculating the entire last year based on secondary data. We then took the time to thoroughly ensure how we want to obtain our primary data, from whom, and how this fits into the overall picture of Scope 1 and 2 emissions, meaning our own emissions and the energy emissions we have sourced, because many neglect this. They say, okay, I have a supplier and they have these emissions, and I will now pass that on to my customer. That's not correct. One also has their own emissions that need to be accounted for. Defining and clarifying this overall context is now largely completed. We are now starting, as Lars has already mentioned, with the onboarding of the key suppliers who make the largest contribution. Connecting with their systems, providing support in understanding what they are expected to contribute, and also ensuring the regulatory compliant allocation to the correct Scope 3 categories, as there is indeed a category for transport and distribution. However, the ISO has put us in the fortunate position of not only having to report emissions, but also having to separately report the emissions from the procurement of fuel for transport and the emissions part of my supply chain. These are the so-called well-to-tank and then tank-to-wheel emissions. They must be processed and reported separately. Building everything requires proper preparation, and we have really done very well in this collaboration. The goal is to have a fully integrated system by 2025 that can effectively manage a high-end sustainable supply chain, ensuring compliance with regulations such as ISO and the European Sustainability Reporting Directive. Everything looks very promising, and we are right on schedule.
That was almost a closing remark that would have fit very well, as time is also about to run out. Karim, thank you very much for that. We can talk until the end, because interestingly, no one has asked any questions in the comment section so far. That could be quickly remedied now if anyone wants to. Otherwise, I'll just take that as a compliment that we explained things well. There was a lot of information in there. I would say 2001. I'd like to give the floor back to Lars-Kristian at the end. If you look at this plan here, maybe glance a bit into the future. It ends with this green bar rising towards 2025. What are you looking forward to, and what might come after that?
So the challenges are not getting any smaller. It really comes down to the fact that at some point, we will have to report CSRD data. We will likely find ourselves in a situation as a corporate group. And of course, we want to prepare ourselves as well as described here, so that we can manage this not only for ourselves, but also provide our suppliers with the best support possible, and simply be the best partner they can imagine in this regard, so that they are as well positioned as we hope to be.
Wonderful. I would say we have actually rounded that off very well. It was fun talking to both of you. I will now show the contact addresses on the last slide again, in case anyone who listened would like to get in touch with you. Here are the email addresses. Let's leave them up for a moment. And there is a QR code to the download area at UBIRCH, where you can find a range of informational materials about logistics, sustainability, and the ESG Data Exchange Network product. I would like to thank both of you for this exciting conversation. I learned an incredible amount. Time flew by. I always think that's a good sign that you absorbed a lot. Thank you, Yusan, to all the listeners who were present and who have attentively listened, showing us that they find the topic exciting. That was the UBIRCH Talk. on the topic of logistics and sustainability. A heartfelt thank you to the university.
Thank you very much.
Hello.